Good day to you. Have you had the chance to travel to another country? I'm not saying if you haven't that it's a bad thing. I'm just asking because I want to know, because if you do travel to another country, you see how vastly different the media are. For example, if you go to Sweden and you listen to the radio, where I'm going next week actually, taking my final class from ESU Comparative Media on a study abroad class trip, if you go to Sweden and you listen to radio at a gas station, you will hear swear words quite frequently. Usually they're American tunes. And it's not something that you hear on American radio because we have these very strict laws regarding obscenity. But in Sweden, it's no problem. They treat language in media as language it should occur in real life. That is, media should reflect real life. So that's what we're talking about today. We're taking on really a brand new set of chapters in this class as we head into our final third of the class. We're moving beyond the inventions of individual technologies, and we're going to move to broader discussions of mass media. And we're starting today with talking about mass media and how they get rooted in societies and how mass media can be so different in countries compared to other countries. That's what we're talking about today. And I gotta say, I'm not at all happy with how this chapter is constructed. I don't like the way it starts out with a lot of scary, bad stuff about journalists being killed. Yes, that happens, but I believe the world is an oyster, really waiting to be explored. That's why I'm here in Mexico, and that's why I'm taking my class to Sweden, because the rest of the world presents a lot of eye-opening experiences, especially when you discuss media. So my task today is to try and get across that point while also discussing the chapter material. And the chapter starts out with what are called theories of the press. Press is a term that's outdated. It used to refer to newspapers. That's when these theories were developed, when there was only newspapers. There weren't electronic media so much. But we're going to refer to these theories as theories of how media should operate. That's what we're talking about today. And we're going to start with the very first theory, which is an old theory. It's called authoritarian theory. It's from the 1500s. It's the oldest of the theories. And in hindsight, when we look at authoritarian theory, we think, oh, how could anybody live under that kind of system of setting up media? And yet it's a theory that still applies today in some of our media if you take a closer look. I'm going to mention that. So authoritarian theory is like your parents, right? Your parents have your best interests in mind when you're younger. They make rules like curfews and who you can have as friends and what you have to eat for your diet. And yeah, that extends beyond when most people want it to extend, but the idea is that they have more wisdom than you do, and you're too youthful to know what's good for you. And so they have to take that role of making authoritarian decisions. And that's kind of like authoritarian theory. It has its roots, however, in societies that have royalty for the most part, and then later military at the top of the government. That is to say that these societies are based on, there's a structure of wealth and knowledge that exists, and the people who are the elite people, if they're royal, if they're military, if they are of a generation of relatives that have been passed down, those people have your best interest in mind. That's the thinking, so they make the decisions. And in authoritarian media countries, the media are subservient to the ruler. The ruler is like this gateway to God. That's what they provide. The ruler knows more, has more intelligence, is wiser, and the ruler works on the best behalf of the public. And so media are just subservient. Media have to do what the rulers say, and the media have to believe that the ruler knows what the best interests are, and the ruler is going to make decisions about media that are sometimes draconian if media deviate from what's expected. In authoritarian societies where you have authoritarian media systems, you also often have vulnerable societies. These are countries that are susceptible to disease, susceptible to invasions from surrounding countries, susceptible to internal conflicts like the Civil War that we had in this country. And so the thinking is you need to have a strong ruler to prevent the country from collapsing. And if media deviate from the rules that are allowed by, for example, criticizing the ruler or exposing corruption in the government of the ruler, then the media are really undermining the stability of the country, which is absolutely necessary. It's first and foremost. And so authoritarianism is a very strong way of growing up a media system. It says that if you want to have a media property, if you want to be a TV station or a website, then you have to submit to a permit process. You have to be approved. And if you deviate from what the rules are, you're not going to receive a permit. Media are privately owned in authoritarian societies. We're going to find that's a different structure of ownership than we find in the next media theory that we're talking about. But suffice it to say, you can be punished very hard in an authoritarian society if you break the rules. For example, in an authoritarian media system where obscenity is restricted, if you break the rule and you use obscenity, then you could be put in jail in an authoritarian country. All right, so let's move on to the next theory now. That's the libertarian theory. This is the theory that's probably most associated with the United States. Libertarian theory comes about in the 1600s and 1700s, and it's sort of a reaction to authoritarian theory. It's saying, no, the media do not belong to the government. The media really should be a separate institution from the government. And at the root of that word, liber is free, right? That's what liber is meaning in this Latin definition is free. So it's the media are free from the government. And the media need a free press in a libertarian system so that the media can decide for themselves what they should air and what they should not air. Oftentimes, in a libertarian system, you have the marketplace of ideas being discussed. You know all about that. That's what the United States is very much based on, as a marketplace of supply and demand. And that's what libertarian tends to want to be the governing procedures for media is let the public, let the audience, that's what we're really talking about here, let the audience decide what TV shows should be canceled. Let the audience decide whether reporters are going too far in criticizing the president. Let the media decide whether they should or should not cover gun massacres. That's what a libertarian system is all about. In essence, media should be free from government control. The weakness of a libertarian system, in my opinion and others, is that it is not really thought of in terms of capitalism. In a capitalist media structure where most of the media, if not all of them, are making money, you also have the influence of advertisers and of corporations and companies and really business enterprises influencing media to the extent that, for example, if Disney had an accident, I've mentioned this before in another context, if there was an accident at Disneyland or Disney World and that accident was fatal, would you know about it? Would the Disney properties of ABC or ESPN report on that? Maybe not. That's not in their interest, right? Because then Disney would lose business. And so libertarianism allows for freedom, but it's freedom from government. It doesn't necessarily consider freedom from advertisers and from business. Now let's go on to the next theory. This is the communist theory, which is a word that we often automatically assume to be a bad system of government, especially if you grow up in a capitalist country. Communist theory comes out in the 1800s from Karl Marx, a revolutionary, and he was a German, and he's writing very much about a new system of government that was basically opposing some of the principles of capitalism. Under a communist system, there was only one valid political party, and that's the Communist Party. And that's why in countries like China and North Korea and Cuba, you don't have alternative political parties because they are not considered to be legitimate. If you only have one legitimate philosophy, communism, why have competition? That's the thinking there. Under a communist system, media are an instrument of government propaganda. And that word is used not as a pejorative word, like putting down the word propaganda. It's actually a word that is celebrated in these countries. In fact, in China, you have a ministry of propaganda. And so the press does not have the same function that it does in our society of being a watchdog on government, trying to catch government and doing bad things and corrupt things so that those things are exposed to the public so that it keeps the government honest. No, in a communist society, you have the media as being obedient to the government. The government controls media. In China, if you're a reporter, you already know what the rules are, and so you don't put out a story that's critical of the national government in China, because if you do, it'll be censored. And in fact, there's actually a policing agency of the internet in China that polices people who are attempting to agitate against communist rulers and wanting to overthrow them. But all of these things aside, there are things about communism in a communist society in terms of media operations that are not talked about that are beneficial. I was in China teaching the same class, comparative media, some years ago, and every morning I would hear this, he, hu, ah, ah, he, hu, ah, ah. And I said to myself, what is it? I've got to find what that is. So I went downstairs out of my dorm room and I went across the campus at Beijing, that's where we were. And as I walked across the campus, I saw speakers, audio speakers, every so many feet apart from each other, and I could hear this same lady. So I said, I got to find out what this is. So I went back to the dorm, and I was certain that it was some kind of military tradition getting people ready for a potential invasion. That's what I thought it was. Turns out, according to the dorm attendants, that this is the exercise lady. This is the exercise lady, and she's helping people do sit-ups and push-ups and squat thrusts and whatever else is part of it. And so communism actually has part of its philosophy being that media should raise the tastes of the public, raise the health of the public, raise people up. That's why under communist systems you have opera being funded, or in the case of China, you have the melody opera, which is an old tradition of media. And so communism is very different from authoritarianism and libertarianism in terms of the role of government. It's not just in terms of stopping people from criticizing the government, which is not allowed in China, at least the national government. You're allowed to criticize municipal governments, smaller governments. But it's also about lifting up the society and not letting it descend into, I don't know, to make kind of a joke, 24 hours of the Kardashians, right? What does that really do for you intellectually, emotionally, philosophically, etc.? Now let's move on to another theory for how media should operate, theories of media. This one is also seen widely in the United States. This is the social responsibility theory. The social responsibility theory grew up in the 1940s. It grew out of World War II, where there was a lot of cynicism in the media. In fact, if you were to go to a movie in World War II, often the trailer beforehand would be a cartoon that says, "Kill a Jap today." Can you believe that? Kill a Jap today? Now, we were at war with the Japanese. They bombed Pearl Harbor, but by today's standards, that would be considered inhumane. So social responsibility theory didn't like how media were stirring up hatred and cynicism, and social responsibility got established by a professor in Chicago named Hutchins. And Professor Hutchins put together a commission where he developed social responsibility theory. And this is all about assuming that media have a privileged position in society. Like if you want to hold a press conference because you don't like the parking situation at ESU, could you get people to come out to your press conference? Probably not. You might have a friend that comes out, but media can call a press conference anytime they want, and they can roll out an executive at a company and they can command an audience. That's the power they have. And media are the ones that reach millions and thousands of people every single day, TV, internet, etc. So that is a privileged position. And because media have a privileged position in our society, then they have to act with responsibility. They have to provide news and information to make the political system work. And that news and information, it can be biased, but overall it needs to be balanced, right? If you have a left bias, you have to have a right bias in the media as well. That's why in many TV talk shows, you'll see when it comes to political shows, you'll see somebody from the Republican Party and somebody from the Democrat Party to try and balance out opinions. And that's part of social responsibility theory. In a social responsibility system, the media are acting as a watchdog on government. You need media to play that role. Otherwise, the government is going to be corrupt. And we even had a piece of history in our country where a whole entire government was brought down, well, a political party within a government, Richard Nixon, by media reporting on the espionage that his operatives conducted during a Democratic convention. So media can provide entertainment in a social responsibility system, but it shouldn't be the only game in town. One way to think of social responsibility is kind of like a referee in a football game. The government is the referee. And if all things are equal, both sides can play, and whoever wins, they won fairly. But if somebody starts to commit infractions like holding or pass interference, then the referee throws a flag on the field and there's a penalty. That's the way the government comes in. And that's why the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, can issue fines to companies, to media companies that violate rules like obscenity. Now let's discuss the next theory. This is the developmental theory. This theory was developed for developing countries. If you're a person who still uses the phrase third world nation, you're not only out of date, but you're also condescending, perhaps without even knowing it. Because the first world, where this terminology was invented in the aftermath of World War II to describe the Cold War that was going on between the Soviet Union and the United States. And first world countries were referring to all those countries that were aligned with the United States, like Canada, for example, whereas second world were referring to all those countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union, like Poland. And then there were third world countries, and these countries are so small and vulnerable that they couldn't be aligned with either of the two major powers, because if one power won, then they would be wiped out as well. So those are third world countries that We don't use that phrasing anymore. We use developing countries to talk about Ghana, to talk about Mexico, to talk about Costa Rica. That's the terms that we use, developing countries. And in that philosophy system, media play a very special role. Media are supposed both to help the government, and also the government is supposed to help the media. Media can't just start up. You don't just start a TV station. You have to train reporters. You have to build out the infrastructure, transmitters, antennas. There's a lot that goes into establishing a TV station in a developing country, which often has poverty, often has a lack of natural resources, often has an industry that it can rely on to stabilize its economy every single year. You need to have government support to build up in media. So newspapers, for example, in Ghana rely on the government to transport those newspapers and get them out to people, because otherwise the transportation costs would be too expensive. But at the same time, media need the government. Media need the government to be open and transparent and hold press conferences and be accessible. And so that's what developing media philosophy is all about, these two entities working together. And it's a newer theory compared to the previous four that we've talked about. And that brings us to our last theory, which is also a newer theory. This is called the democratic participant theory. And this theory grows up behind the idea that because of the electronics that people have today and the social media platforms and the internet, all of those together, the average citizen can make a political statement. You can go on TikTok and you can see plenty of people making statements about the massacre that occurred in Texas. And that's because people have a phone and they can put it on YouTube. They don't have to go through producers. They don't have to go through agents. They don't have to be a star to be noticed. You can accrue your own followers on Facebook or Instagram or wherever. And so the average citizen today has access to the democratic process, and they can start to get more information out there that isn't already out there, because the thinking behind democratic participant theory is that most of the dialogue, most of the discourse, that's the way we refer to dialogue that occurs across society, most of the discourse is controlled by corporations. And corporations aren't going to have the interests of the average citizen in mind necessarily, and that's why you have democratic participant theory. All right, so then the chapter takes a turn to starting to describe areas of the world and how those areas of the world are different from each other when it comes to media systems. I'm going to leave you to read most of that material yourself. I'm going to make some summary statements. I've been to most of these places in the world. We're going to start with Canada. Canada is a huge country. It's the second largest country in the world. You may not have known that. It's bigger than the United States. It's also the U.S.'s biggest trading partner. And by the way, can you name the Prime Minister of Canada? Do you know his name? Yeah, because if you don't, how do you feel? Why do you think that is? Do you think I'm telling you you're stupid by asking that question? No, I'm not asking you that question to prove you're stupid. I'm asking that question to prove that corporate interests here in the United States don't have your necessarily best interests in mind by letting you know who the Canadian Prime Minister is. His name is Justin Trudeau, by the way. You don't know that name probably because he's not reported on, because it's not profitable in the United States to report on Canadian stuff very much unless it's like the Stanley Cup. So it's an example to revert back to why you do have some reactions to just a libertarian capitalist making system. But Canada is occupies a very large geographic area with a lot of sparsity in the population. 90% of the population is living on the border of the United States. And so you have a different system in Canada that's built more like the UK, the United Kingdom, in terms of government funding media to get media content, television content, news content, radio content, preserving traditional music from Canada out to people in remote regions of Canada, including Inuits or Native Canadians. And we have Native Americans, or Native Canadians as well, people living in the icy regions of Canada. So there's a big government-funded media system in Canada. I've taken my students to see it many times. It's called the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Next up is Western Europe and the UK. They're all mentioned in the same breath, although each and every country is so different. Luxembourg is so different from Germany, it's so different from Denmark, it's so different from France, but they're all kind of lumped together. And this region of the world was heavily influenced by World War II. They had been devastated, most of those countries, by World War II. It took years and years to recover from all the bombing, all the carnage, all the hostilities between peoples of different nations. And so in post-World War II Europe, a strong public broadcasting sector was opened up. A public broadcasting sector is where you have public broadcasters who have a prominent place in the media landscape. When you pick up your television, turn on the remote control, and you start going up through the channels, how long does it take before you get to a PBS station? Right? It's like channel 12, and then the next one is like channel 24 on your cable selection. Not so in public service countries, in countries that have public service media, mostly European countries. For example, in Britain, if you pick up the remote control and you go through the first 5 channels, you're going to find BBC One, BBC Two, and then you get to a commercial channel, which is going to be ITV. You may not know the names of these channels. And then another one, which is a commercial channel, which is Channel 5. So 2 out of the 4 choices are BBC channels, right? So your public broadcasting has a much greater presence. And the way that public broadcasting is normally paid for in these countries is through the license fee. Just like you have to get a license to drive a car, if you get television in the United Kingdom, then you have to get a license to watch that television, and that license fee, which is about $400, goes to paying for BBC content, so that the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, does not have to rely on advertising to fund its content. Next up is Central and Latin America. Central and Latin America, most of Central Latin America is also dominated by commercial broadcasting, just like the United States. And within Latin America, the big players are Mexico and Brazil. They are putting out most of the content that is exported to other countries, and they have the most robust media systems. Both of them are producing this genre of movies and television called the telenovela, which is a television novel. You can think of it that way. It's like a soap opera, but they're different in Mexico. For example, the good guy and the bad guy is always very clear. There's usually differences that are between 2 people romantically involved that relate to what class they come from. An upper class person is interested in a lower class person. The families don't like it. That's television novellas often work that way. Also, though, in Central and Latin America, you have a lot more threats to journalists, unfortunately, because of drug cartels and other crime syndicates. So journalists have a more dangerous occupation in those countries. Next up are Islamic countries and Middle Eastern countries, where the religion of Islam is really what governs the media system. The Quran, the religious text of Islam and for Muslims, is far more comprehensive than the Bible in terms of laying out law and government and how people should dress and how they should act. And so that naturally extends to media as well. And media are very tightly controlled by Islamic governments. And it's illegal to insult government in the media. It's illegal to show nudity, to use obscenity, to show drinking in many countries. And so in this region of the world, you can say there's a strong authoritarian presence, but at the same time, social media have taken many Middle Eastern countries by storm and sort of defied the control the government has. The revolution that took place in Egypt several years ago, 10 years ago, where the president was overthrown, was called the Facebook Revolution, because people found out about flash mobs and other things through social media, and that's where they came out and caused a revolution. Let's talk about Africa now. I've been to Ghana, Africa. Africa is full of developing countries. When I was in Ghana, they didn't even have a highway that ran all the way from the north of the country to the south of the country. Impossible to drive because there was no highway. Africa is still largely rural, still largely tribal. You have kingdoms in many African countries where the king has more power than the president. When I was in Ghana, there was a kingdom that the government felt should adopt outdoor toilets because most people were just going to the bathroom in nature. And you can imagine some of the health problems that might create. But until the king would endorse the idea for outhouses to be placed in the villages, people were not going to use them. And that's often how things go in Africa. The best developed media system in Africa is in South Africa. It's the first country to have radio. It has 11 different languages, South Africa, like many countries. And so it's very difficult to organize media content, right, when you have 11 different languages to cover. There's a strong connection in Africa that I noticed between African music and reggae music, and that makes sense, right? Africans, through the slavery triangle, the horrific slavery triangle, left a legacy and a stench on history that we're still trying to overcome, that it did create trade between culture, between Africa, and the Caribbean. So if you hear reggae music, you often see the roots of it in Africa. Now we're going to move to Russia and the former Soviet republics. Again, this is the scale of the country has a lot to do with its media system. It's the biggest country in the world, Russia is. It's got 11 time zones. In the United States, we have 4, right? So you can imagine 11 time zones. What do you do when you want to do a nightly network television newscast at 11 o'clock at night when it's 11 o'clock in the morning in another part of the country? It's a whole other difficult situation to overcome in terms of programming. In Russia, you have a tightly controlled media. It's considered to be an authoritarian system where the government actually owns most of the media properties, especially on television, or has a stake in ownership. And so when we're talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, you often see Russia being criticized by Western countries for saying the people in Russia are not really getting the real story about what's happening in Ukraine. Of course, Russia says the same thing about the United States because corporate interests are controlling what we're seeing. That's for you to decide, but I want to let you know that in Russia, you do have the government that has ownership in television. You don't have that in the United States because we're under a libertarian system. Now we're moving to Asia. Asia, again, is, you can't really talk about all these different countries, and Taiwan and Indonesia and Cambodia and Vietnam and China. They're all different, right? But we are trying to lump them all here as well. In Asia, most of the countries are either most of the media systems are either government controlled or they are run by public corporations, which are reporting to the government. 3 of the countries that are highlighted in the chapter include India, where newspapers are still a big business, and where state-run television is now given way to private television, in other words, commercial television. We have China that's discussed in the chapter. We've already talked about China in this class a little bit. And we've got Japan. Japan is probably the media system that's the closest to the United States in terms of commercial, private, profit-making media. And we have a strong connection with Japan because we set up their government after World War II with General MacArthur. And in addition, many of the world's electronics come from Japan. Sony is a mammoth company that makes many products, some of which you have in your house right now. One of the most popular forms of media content to come out of Japan is anime and manga, mangas it's called, which are cartoons that are targeted towards adults. And those cartoons, which we wouldn't consider to be cartoons, do contain violence and pornography. And then we come to the United States, our country, which really you have to get out of to be able to learn what it's all about when it comes to a media system. It takes going to another country to find out how different your media system truly is. So the United States really is an insular country. That is, you don't have a lot of outside country media making its way into your country. I mean, yeah, Justin Bieber, Shania Twain, they're Canadian. We have lots of Canadian actors in our films, but they almost become Americans. Really, we think of them as Americans when they come to the United States. And how many Canadian TV shows do you see? How many Mexican songs do you hear on the radio? You don't. We don't import much. Why? It's not illegal. They're not censored. It's because corporations in the United States, they don't want that stuff. And here they want you to be buying U.S. stuff. So the average person, therefore, really knows very little about the rest of the world. People that are discussing guns right now, and this may sound like commentary, but I don't mean it to be, they, generally speaking, have not been in a United Kingdom or in an Australia where there are no guns. And they don't generally know what it feels like to be in a society where that's the case. And we can relate that back to media because we're not getting much from other countries. You can go seek out information about other countries using the internet, but by and large, you watch television at night, you're not going to see many foreign shows. Whereas if you're in England, much smaller country, or France, again, smaller country, every night you're going to find American television shows and some German shows and Italian films because you have a lot more exchange going on with the rest of the world. So there you have it, the world to consider. It's a big place. We've tried to make it a little bit smaller in the chapter, but it really takes traveling and experiencing media systems elsewhere to have a comparative basis to look at your own country. Have a great day.